Right. Hi, Mr. Professor.
Good morning, Kadir. How are you?
Oh, fine, thanks. And you? Welcome our session.
Thank you. I'm glad to participate.
Yes, we have 2 minutes. I think can we wait for participants?
Absolutely.
Are you in Australia right now, Mr. Professor?
No, I'm in the United States.
United States.
Yeah.
Hi, Dylan. How are you going?
Good. How are you doing, Martin?
Hi, Martin.
I'm very well. I don't know if you remember me, but I sought your advice over a couple of emails a couple of years ago. Do you remember?
What was the advice about?
It was about publishing in your journal, Journal of Heritage Tourism, and it was to do with, what was it? I was considering using the same theory a second time, which was Holt's model. And it was to do with Anzac type, empirical research. And I remember you saying that what were you saying? You were saying that where I got the information from is just the laboratory, and that I needed to transcend that. I think you said at the time.
I do. So
anyway,
did you?
Anyway, I put you in the acknowledgements at the end there. You got
Wow, I've never been acknowledged before. So thanks, Martin.
Oh, there you go. How are you anyway?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm pretty good. It's 10 o'clock here in Perth, Australia. So yes, I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say anyway.
Oh, it's great to see you.
You were very helpful. You were very helpful and very courteous. So I just want to say thank you for that. And
you're welcome.
It means a lot.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Martin. I hope I didn't lead you astray too badly. So sounds okay.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Professor, would you like to start with your speech? And I would like to present Professor Dylan Timothy. He will make the keynote speech, whose topic is titled "The Heritage Values of Religious Tourism."
You want me to start, did you say now?
Yes, would you like?
Yeah.
Yes, you can start, I think, if you are ready.
Okay, let me see if I can share the screen here. Where did it go? No, that's not the screen I wanted to share. Hang on just a second. There we go. All right, can you see this presentation here? Are we able to see that?
Yes,
okay.
we can see now.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference and Kadir and others and for inviting me to participate. It's a great honor and a privilege to be here with you. I wish we could be together in Mardin. It's a beautiful city and a beautiful part of Turkey. And so, but we do what we can do and we're happy that we have other alternatives. But in any case, it's a real honor for me to be here and I appreciate the invitation. Normally, I wouldn't wear a suit to a virtual conference, but I actually have a meeting I have to go to as soon as this is over. And so I'm just going to run out the door when I finish the presentation. But it's really nice to see everyone here, and I appreciate those of you who are attending. So I was asked, the theme of the conference obviously being both religious tourism and heritage tourism. I had discussed this with the organizers, what should I talk about? And so we kind of decided on this idea of looking at heritage or religious tourism as heritage tourism. And so I think I will progress on that theme. And of course, because my mind is always all over the place, I'll probably diverge from that theme a little bit, but hopefully come back to it toward the end of the presentation. But basically, I want to talk a little bit about the heritage perspective of religious tourism. So, sorry, got a sensitive mouse here. What is heritage? And I know that this has probably been defined throughout the conference already yesterday and earlier today. But heritage really, and this is not my definition, by the way, this is a fairly standard definition out there in the heritage studies field. It has three primary principles: what we inherit from the past, and that has no parameters, okay? What we use and value today, and what we desire to pass on to future generations. This is really what defines heritage. And so if we're talking about tourism that is based on these principles of an inheritance that we receive from the past, from previous generations, that we use and value as heritage today, and something that we want to pass on to future generations, then tourism, probably most tourism, in fact, is a form of heritage tourism. And this is something that I've tried to talk about over the last several years, really, that there's very few forms of tourism that do not have a heritage connotation or that do not have some kind of connection to heritage. So it may manifest in physical or tangible ways, or it may also manifest in intangible ways related to people and places. So religious heritage, it is one of the most pervasive elements of human heritage, together with things like language, folklore, family traditions. All of those things are part of human heritage. And so religion, if we look at the anthropological work over the centuries, we know that religion is definitely one of the defining characteristics of culture and heritage. It involves, religious heritage involves both tangible elements and intangible elements and tangible artifacts. So it includes things such as beliefs, practices, rituals, spaces and places, structures and buildings, pilgrim trails, etc., etc. The list could go on for several pages. But the idea is that religious heritage is both a practice, it is both doctrine, it includes doctrine, it includes beliefs, and it includes sacred spaces and activities. So religious heritage is quite a broad way of looking. And by the way, I would say probably more than half of all heritage around the world that is sold in tourism has some sort of religious foundation. So just to have a look at some trends that are going on, I think it's worthwhile highlighting some of the trends that are that have gone on in the past in this realm of research, and then look at some ongoing or perhaps current or future trends. So there's been a lot of research on both supply and demand sides of religious tourism, particularly its economic impacts, which really don't differ much from other forms of tourism or heritage tourism in particular. Its social impacts, the health concerns associated with these large-scale gatherings, the ecological impacts, issues of authenticity, subjective and objective authenticity of places and experiences and spirituality, site management. Dan Olson, who's presented in this conference and who's in attendance now, has done a lot of work on religious site management. Visitor experiences, both religious visitors as well as non-religious visitors. And then this ongoing debate or argument, I call it, or attempt to try to define pilgrims versus tourists, pilgrimage versus tourism. And so there's been a lot of work on that. And then, of course, descriptions of sites and routes. And there's a whole, again, this list could go on and on. This is a sampling of some of the main themes and main threads that have been going on in religious tourism and pilgrimage studies for many decades, in fact. But if we have a look at newer trends or more recent ways of looking at religious tourism or pilgrimage as a form of heritage tourism, these are some of the current things that are going on, current trends that are going on in research, and also within the industry as marketing and management people have to deal with these issues as well. So looking at trails and routes and how these have evolved, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Also catering to the religious needs of tourists, such as pilgrims and non-pilgrims as well. So this includes both devout pilgrims who are traveling for very religious reasons, as well as for people who of a specific religion who might just be traveling on holiday, not necessarily on a pilgrimage. The heritage of the grand versus the heritage of the ordinary. And I'll just spend a moment on each of these. Volunteer tourism as a spiritual experience, commercialization of religious heritage, spiritual versus religious, religious experiences, and cross-border resource protection and promotion. Some of these things, again, parallel general research in heritage tourism studies as well. And so that's kind of part of the connection I really want to make. So times are changing, and so we're starting to see new ways of viewing religious tourism, pilgrimage, and heritage tourism in general. Tourists, including religious tourists and pilgrims, are evolving in their expectations, their desired experiences, and their choices of destinations. Even very devout pilgrims are choosing alternative pilgrimage destinations, for example, based on other variables such as entertainment and leisure experiences and things like that. People's tastes are becoming more sophisticated and changing they're actually changing the nature of religious tourism demand, as well as supply, which we'll talk about again. Religious tourism is now seen as a major form of tourism, which in many cases resembles mass tourism and its negative impacts. So we have often lauded pilgrimage or religious tourism as this sort of form of very sensitive, very careful, a very limited type of tourism that only has positive impacts, particularly for the pilgrims themselves. But what we're seeing now is this massification, this creation of pilgrimage / religious tourism into this mass form of tourism. And it always has been, but it's only recently been accepted and acknowledged as such. So one of the main things, the current things of thinking is this idea of sustainability with regard to religious tourism. And again, the issues related to sustainability in religious tourism parallel those in general heritage tourism. So most discussions on sustainability in religious tourism is focused on the environmental issues related to how tourism affects the natural environment, but also the economy and society. And this has been a major concern because religious tourism it has been very much a form of mass tourism and has been as equally destructive as, in many cases, as many other forms of mass tourism. If we see here some examples of, this is in Kushinagar, India, where Buddha died. And so, of course, this temple has been built on the site of Buddha's death, and millions of Buddhists and Hindus, particularly, as well as non-Hindus and non-Buddhists, but primarily Buddhists and Hindus visit this place every year to pay their respects and worship Buddha. And this is the temple that's built on this site. But again, you can see the sorts of physical impacts because people have this tendency, whether they're spiritual or religious or not, there's this tendency to want to leave something of themselves in the destination to mark that they've been there. So again, this idea of pilgrimage or religious tourism being different from heritage tourism, it's just not true. The same sorts of impacts happen as well. And as I said at the outset, the experiences people seek, the elements of religion that they utilize and undertake in these journeys are in fact part of their heritage. So if we look at this, this mass perspective on tourism. The largest tourist gatherings in the world, obviously, are religious, such as the Kumbh Mela and the Hajj. Religious sites are not only for religious tourists, many of them have become the most important tourist attractions in regions. If you look at, there's a lot of examples where the primary iconic heritage sites are religious in nature, and they may still be active religious sites where rituals and ceremonies and worshiping continues, but they also serve as major tourist attractions. And of course, management has to deal with the conflict between worshipers and leisure travelers and casual visitors. UNESCO's World Heritage List includes multitudes, hundreds and hundreds of religious sites and heritage places. And it's becoming kind of what I said before earlier, that religious heritage is probably one of the most pervasive forms of heritage, whether it's tangible or intangible in the world, that is consumed as a tourism product. Religious heritage and religious tourism are widely used to brand tourism destinations. And so destination marketing organizations or management organizations use religion itself, but also religious places and religious structures, particularly those of a global nature that are well known globally, are used to brand destinations, and they're often used to create the iconic image of a specific place. And so this contributes to that massification, the mass development of religious tourism or other tourism based on religious sites. And then, of course, we're starting to see that even pilgrimage trails are now considered cultural or natural trails for any type of visitor. And so a lot of these traditional religious routes, particularly those in Europe, have now become mass tourism. Beyond pilgrimage, they've become mass tourist spaces, in essence. And there's actually a lot of economic development that goes alongside those trails. And if you look at, for example, this picture of Mecca, you can see that this is perhaps the epitome of massification, and it always has been, of one of the most famous pilgrimages in the world, obviously, where 2.5 to 3 million people gather in one very small space at one specific time. And if you look at the landscape around the Great Mosque here, you'll see that there's a lot of construction going on, there's a lot of destruction going on. And this has really been quite a controversial issue over the last 15 or 20 years, where parts of the old city of Mecca have been really destroyed and torn down in favor of building large-scale hotels and resorts, golf courses, amusement parks, shopping centers, etc., to cater to the new type of pilgrim that, which used to, centuries ago or 50 years ago, used to arrive by camel or by car and stay in a tent or camp under the stars or stay in a cheap hostel. Now all that's, of course, being replaced by this mass form of religious tourism. And the landscape, the commercial landscape, illustrates this very, very well. There's a little bit of research going on this. I don't know if that was mentioned in the conference, but it was it's quite fascinating what's going on here in particular. And then, of course, you've got the economic side for this village in southern Germany in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, which has the Passion Play every 10 years. And it's a huge economic boost for the community, even when the play isn't being held. But it also becomes this form of mass tourism through theater, etc. So commercializing pilgrimage is something that is of major concern from every perspective, from religious organizations to communities where pilgrimage occurs, to tour companies, etc. So all stakeholders are interested in this idea of commercializing pilgrimage, just the way heritage in general has been commercialized. So one of these trends in the commercialization, based on this idea of mass growth of religious tourism and pilgrimage, is the idea that, and we're starting to see this really emerge just in the last 10 years or so, a lot of research on fulfilling the travel needs of religious adherents. And again, this is both those who travel specifically for religious purposes, but also those who belong to a religion who are not necessarily traveling for religious purposes. So that includes things such as food preparation, food protocols, lodging, prayer facilities, gendered spaces, and things like that really do cater to the specific needs of specific groups. And I like to show this picture to my students. I can't see the top of the picture because of the signage on the Zoom, but I hope you can see the full picture. If you look up in that little top corner of this hotel room, you can see there's a Qiblat marker, which looks like this. And so if you are in, a Muslim-friendly destination, now this happens to be Malaysia, which is predominantly an Islamic country, but even the hospitality and tourism industry in Malaysia is trying to become more Muslim-friendly. And so, but we're also seeing this happening in other places, in Europe, in North America, in Australia, New Zealand, even particularly New Zealand. They're starting to try to cater more to the Muslim marketplace, which is a high spending market. So even though a Muslim would not necessarily be visiting New Zealand or Austria as a pilgrim, they still have, many of them, not all, many of them still have religious needs that need to be satisfied while they're traveling. And so the hospitality industry is really beginning to cater to this. And it really is a form of, commercialization of religion in a sense to facilitate the needs of the travelers. So this Qiblat marker is it's good for the Muslim guests who need the direction of Mecca. And of course, they have the Muslim, and the Qiblat sign is on the ceiling. There's a Quran or a Bible if you need one, that sort of thing. And then, of course, at this particular hotel for August 2014, when I took the picture, they had the prayer schedule out on the front desk. And so this was, again, very, very helpful for guests. They didn't need to search for it on the internet. They could just see it at the front desk. And so, again, becoming more Muslim friendly is something that many destinations are doing, not just in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia. But also here's on an airline providing a prayer room. So this is on an airplane, a 747, I believe. And this is an area that's closed off in the galley where you can go to pray. So even on an airplane, they're providing spaces for worship, spaces for religious adherence. And if you look at, this is a room in Fatima, Portugal, a very popular Catholic destination. And this is not a typical hotel room. This would be what we would call a pilgrimage hotel room, I suppose, because typically these have several beds, 3, 4, 5, or 6 beds even, which groups or families would share to save on costs. And so you would see this kind of bedroom arrangement in a lot of pilgrimage destinations. But even catering to the needs of people traveling through airports, like this airport chapel in Cyprus, for instance, where travelers can go to pray or relax between flights. And this then extends beyond just facilitating the religious needs of travelers. It also includes looking at the linkages between religious tourism and other elements of the tourism system. Because obviously we're very concerned and not just providing for their needs, but how do the various service sectors within tourism get involved in religious tourism? The transportation sector, the food services sector, lodging, shopping facilities, and guiding services are a big part of that, for example. So this includes providing what they call rest houses or hospitalitaires or different kinds of businesses that basically cater to the lodging needs of tourists. And of course, most religious tourists or pilgrims stay in normal hotels, but there are specialized ones such as this one, the Pilgrims Rest House and Guest House, that cater specifically to their needs. Here is another one. You can see the sign says accommodation only for pilgrims. And so regular tourists can't necessarily even stay there. And of course, you have airline services and Christian busing and motor coach services. And so there's a whole wide range of services provided that cater specifically to the needs of religious tourists. Another perspective on is the commercialization of pilgrimage and through souvenirs. There's this, multi-billion-dollar religious souvenir industry every year, and it has come to be these mass-produced icons or images that they rely on to sell to tourists, and which tourists seek. Pilgrims are like any other tourist, in fact, where they really do want souvenirs, they want mementos, but also they also want to provide offerings, perhaps in many regards. So there's different types of souvenirs within pilgrimage destinations, which personally I think needs more research because if you look here below, for example, the third point down, different denominations require different souvenirs. So if you look within Islam or even within Judaism, and particularly within Christianity, at places like in the Holy Land, in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, for example, there's different denominations, different sects of Christianity need different types of souvenirs. So you'll have Catholic souvenirs and Orthodox souvenirs and Methodist souvenirs, etc. And they just have differences in their biblical interpretations, which kind of creates this need for different types of souvenirs. And even within individual shops, and we've seen this a lot in Israel and Palestine, looking at even within shops, there's different sections for different religious organizations. So you'll have a Russian or Greek Orthodox section or a Catholic section, etc. And then, of course, well, that last point I'm not going to necessarily go over, other than to say that destruction is pretty severe. Pilgrims will actually try to hunt for souvenirs at archaeological sites and things like that. But that's not really commercialization per se. So we also see religion being sold, not just as religion, but from a tourism perspective in particular, as this idea that it really is a multi-billion-dollar, probably could be even trillions of dollars, in fact, from souvenir production and consumption to other services that are created and sold in the name of religious tourism or pilgrimage. And so you have a whole slew of different types of things, other services, and we'll talk about that in a second, but things like biblical food, virtual and cyber pilgrimages, internet purchases. You can purchase religious souvenirs of a place and never have to go there, but you can claim them the spiritual blessings of possessing that sort of souvenir from that auspicious place. So this is something, sort of a form, and that's also a whole new area of research that many dissertations and theses could be done about. But so these are areas that really haven't received a lot of research attention, but really probably should. And then, of course, such things as the package tour, the pilgrimage cruises, and some of these pilgrimage cruises that are sold as pilgrimages or sold as religious cruises have very little to do with religion or have very little to do with religious or spiritual heritage, but they're sold as such based primarily on the fellowship or the communitas that's established between the travelers as a motivational force. Okay, if you've got a whole cruise full of Lutherans or Baptists, that itself creates some kind of a spiritual entity, whether or not the sites visited actually have anything to do with religious heritage. So if you look at the commercialization of religious sites, and for example, here in Fatima in Portugal, you've got pilgrimage rooms for rent up above, and then you've got lots and lots of different souvenirs. And of course, pilgrimage souvenirs are no different from other souvenirs, other than they typically have a religious orientation, but then they also have other generic. So it ranges from very, very, very core religious icons and objects that have a ritualistic nature all the way into very general souvenirs that might have very little or nothing to do with the particular destination. And so the commercialization through souvenirs is something that has not been well researched, but we're seeing it on the ground like this and deserves a little bit more research. When we talk about the spatiality or the geographic distribution of souvenirs, even within a specific shop or a specific community in religious destinations, such as here in Bethlehem in Palestine, you can see there are different, the olive wood carvings are very popular as souvenirs there, but there are certain sections of these shops that are devoted to specific denominations. And the shopkeepers know, they can tell when a group of one denomination comes in, they can tell which church they belong to. And so they will immediately carry them to that section of the store. So it's a really interesting phenomenon to deal with and to research. And but even on the small scale, like an individual shop or a village, you'll often see these sort of differentiations and commercializations. And even the mass production of Kana wine in Israel, for example, to cater to, particularly this one caters to Greek and Russian Orthodox, as you can see from the signage. But this mass production of Jesus's wine is something that, for example, this idea that you take a scriptural reference of an event and you turn it into this mass-produced tourism product. I think this is one of the better examples I've seen of the retail commercialization of pilgrimage. And this is in Lourdes, France, where really the entire town of Lourdes has become a huge, major tourism destination. But of course, it originated with the shrine and with devout pilgrims, and now it's become this very, very large scale pilgrimage, religious tourism, and other general tourism type of destination. And the commercial landscape, full of hotels, full of restaurants, full of bars. You know, people can go visit the shrine and then get drunk afterwards, or it's a very common sort of event in places like this. So this over-commercialization, what does that tell us from a destination perspective? And I have a point on another slide, but I'll go ahead and make this point now, that if you look at Lourdes as an important Catholic pilgrimage destination, the city of Lourdes doesn't care if it's pilgrims or leisure tourists who are coming to town, because they're spending who spends the 50 euros doesn't matter to the community. And so trying to differentiate pilgrims from other tourists is a futile attempt when we're talking about economic impact, when we're talking about commercialization, because it matters not at all to the city of Lourdes if it's a devout pilgrim who's camping under the stars, who spends 50 euros in these shops, or whether it's just a bus load of Japanese tourists. And the point is that the stakeholders, the economic development officers of destinations, have very little concern over who's the spender. Again, this is in Mexico City at the Guadalupe pilgrimage destination. And again, the commercialization along the pilgrimage route leading up to the cathedral, you can see there, the basilica. And so it's very, very commercialized. And again, some of the souvenirs are religious in nature, others are just toys, others are just general souvenirs of Mexico. And so there's a whole range of different types of, there's also a geography of souvenirs here. As the closer you get to the actual center or the attraction itself, the church, the more religious the souvenirs become. So there is some sort of gradual change in the geography of souvenirs. And of course you can see here, this is in Taiwan, but at temples everywhere, very commercialized. And most of these are offerings for the temple. But again, you have a lot of general souvenirs as well. And here is Medjugorje in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is, again, extremely commercialized. A lot of the Roman Catholic sites around Europe have been very, very commercialized. Less so if you go to India, for example. Very, very few of the Buddhist and Hindu sites have been over-commercialized to the extent that they have in Europe. But it's happening there, it's happening everywhere as well. This is back in Lourdes again. And then again, these package tours that are now sold as general tours. They're the Roman pilgrimage opera, I don't know what operator, I guess. I don't speak Italian, but they're talking about, you know, flight specials and hotel packages. So it's become a very commercial operation where you buy these tour packages, for example, from to Fatima. These pictures were from Rome, and so you see these packages to Fatima, to Lourdes, etc. You can get 4-star hotels or 3-star hotels. It's no longer a really humble pilgrimage experience the way it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. It's basically a very commercial touristy operation now. And of course, you can buy Christian tours of Rome, for example. So the expansion of other areas of religious heritage beyond churches, temples, cathedrals, and sacred sites is another part of this commercialization or this change that's taking place. And by the way, I'm not saying this is bad, and I'm not saying it's good. I'm very neutral on this issue. But what we have to realize is that different stakeholders have different perspectives on commercialization. So if you actually go into the shrine of Lourdes, there's a gate. It's a huge gated off area. And that is the actual border between the sacred and the profane, where once you're in that gate, there is no commercialization. And so from the church's perspective, that's the most important part of the site. From the town of Lourdes' perspective, it's the commercialization outside that gate is the most important, even though it's the shrine itself that brings 95% of the people there. So here's some other new trends that are going on that I think that need more research. So this idea of scripture-based food. If you look at the Quran, if you look at the Bhagavad Gita and the Bible and all of these sacred writings, they all have verses and stories associated with food. And so food is an incredibly important part of human heritage. Just like language, just like religion itself, food is one of the long-lasting and everlasting sorts of manifestations of culture. Food tells us stories about struggles with nature. It tells us stories about poverty, and it tells us stories about survival and colonialism and migration, et cetera, et cetera. So food is a laboratory in itself of heritage. And so when we're talking about religious food, this is really quite an interesting twist on it, because we're starting to see this, particularly within Christian tourism to the Holy Land in Israel and Palestine. You'll see a lot of biblical themed food, restaurants, as well as meals and things like that. We're starting to see a lot of virtual pilgrimages. And some places are using this as a means of crowd control. Some are using it because in the last 2 years, because of the COVID pandemic, but even before that, it had started becoming popular. Particularly the Hajj in Mecca, for those who can no longer afford a pilgrimage to Mecca, they can undertake an online, virtual Hajj at home, for example. And then, of course, internet purchases. This can be anything from souvenirs, like I mentioned before. You can buy a bottle of holy water from a place, or you can buy some Jordan River water or a rock from the Sea of Galilee online. You don't have to actually visit there. And so this is becoming part of this commercialization. But beyond that, it calls into question things such as authenticity, which is, as you all know, is a huge discussion point in heritage studies in general. But in religious heritage tourism, which we're talking about, it opens up new doors and new concerns about, look, if I possess this stone from the Sea of Galilee, I can keep it at my house and show everybody that, look, I have the stone. I can lie about it and say I went there and got it, but really I just got on eBay and bought it, for example, or something like that. And so there's all different ways that this might manifest in people's lives through internet purchases. The idea of pilgrimage cruises, which we talked about before, are growing. You see a lot of Christian cruises to China, and China is not typically considered a Christian destination. But what we're seeing is, again, that solidarity, that Christian atmosphere that's created on the cruise ship. But then when they arrive at port, they go, it's a form of solidarity tourism, if you've heard that term before, where they go and they meet with Chinese Christians to support them, because Chinese Christians are not allowed to openly practice Christianity in China. And so these Christian tourists will then go on this cruise pilgrimage, and every port they stop in, they go and then they meet with these Christian congregations to show support, to bring them gifts, that kind of thing, and to show them support. This is becoming an increasingly popular. That's just one example. There are many types of pilgrimage cruises that have really very little to do with religion or pilgrimage. And then, of course, well, that's what I just explained the last one. But if you're talking about food landscapes and biblical food, you'll see a lot of symbolisms, biblical or scriptural symbolisms, such as here in Jerusalem, the land of milk and honey is a very common theme throughout the Bible, and sort of the Holy Land as a blessed land and as a sacred land. And so you'll see a lot of it in the commercial development of places in the Holy Land. Holy Juice, for example. These tour companies will set up these Last Supper, the Last Supper of Jesus before he was crucified. They'll set up these Last Supper meals. They will set up these biblical meals where you can eat the types of food that would have been eaten in this region in the Middle East, for example, 2,000 years ago. And so this has become a really very, very popular attraction that a lot of Christian tour packages choose to utilize. And then, of course, you find, if you do a search for the internet, you'll find many, many different kinds of Christian cruises, biblical cruises, and some of them do stop at biblical sites. For example, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, Egypt, Israel, Turkey, Greece, etc. But some of them just simply have nothing to do with the Bible, or have nothing to do with actual religion per se, but they create spiritual and religious experiences through that solidarity. So there's some other current trends and issues. Spaces of pilgrimage tourism, and this could go on for pages and hours, but I'm just going to look really quickly at trails and routes. And if you look at the bottom point there where it says purposive and organic, and I've written about trails in the past, and we've discussed how trails can be organically evolved, which is the case for most ancient pilgrimage trails, such as the Camino de Santiago, for example. This is something that just organically evolved, the sets of trails to Santiago. As pilgrims decided to travel to the sacred place, or Via Francigena down through Italy to Rome, and then on across the Mediterranean to the Holy Land. These types of trails evolved naturally as pilgrims began to travel over the centuries. But the other form is purposive or proposive, which means that these are trails that are established intentionally as tourism products to link together specific themes. It could be religious architecture. It could be places where Martin Luther visited or taught in Europe. It could be places associated with Confucius, for example, in Asia. And so these are trails that have been planned specifically as a religious tourism product. So the trail traditionally, if you look at traditional pilgrimages, at least in the European and Christian sense, the trail itself was just as important, or even maybe more important than the final destination, because it was that trail, that long and arduous journey, that caused people to be more humble and more receptive to the message of God. And so the trail, or the way, the pilgrim's way, we refer to it, has long been a very, very important part of the experience, and it continues to be for many today. Although the majority are bypassing the trail and just flying in or taking a motor coach in. Scale is critical in this. You have small scale trails, you have large scale trails, trails that might take in 7 or 8 countries, for example, where you have other smaller scale ones that might be just around a city, for instance. So scale is an important consideration. And then, of course, the ever-present religious versus non-religious users. How do we come to terms with devout worshipers being surrounded by photographing, selfie-taking tourists who may disturb the worship, etc. And these are important management implications. And then, of course, the economic impacts. We know that originally, as it was medievally conceived, or even earlier, pilgrimage was not considered necessarily of great economic importance. But today, as I've shown, it's become a very important type of mass tourism in many cases. And even in the places where people still treat pilgrimages they traditionally did, it still is a major, for example, with the Kumbh Mela in India, it's now become a major commercial operation. And so it's not just in the Christian sites, and it's not just with other forms of tourism, even with very religious or spiritual oriented pilgrimage, it has great economic impacts today. Here's an example of a mixed purposive and organic trail, the Pilgrims Trail in Northern Ireland, which basically tracks the trail of St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, and not necessarily the trail he walked personally, but the places he visited, the places he ministered. And so they've developed this sort of purposive trail to link together the sites associated with St. Patrick. And here's his grave, actually. And of course, you have the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, the trail to Santiago, the Way of St. James. Huge, parts of France, Switzerland, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and even the UK and Netherlands, for example. A lot of countries are part of this trail system to Santiago and have significant economic impacts from that. And then you have the Gospel Trail this is in Israel and Palestine. It goes through both areas. This was set up again as a purposely designed trail by the Israeli Ministry of Tourism to bring people to a specific linear trail where they can visit the sites associated with the life of Jesus. So this is a very important. It doesn't necessarily track the footprints of Jesus, but it goes to the places that he visited and ministered in. And this is another trail. This is called the Gospel Trail, and this was actually developed. And this is just one particular site in a city. This was developed by a private organization. So we don't have a lot of time to go into any more of these, but just also religious heritage and politics is something that heritage is extremely political in every aspect. Religion is extremely political. So when you put the two together, it's extremely, extremely political. And so you have a lot of heritage politics involved in religion and religious tourism as well that have major implications for supply and demand and site management and destination management. We won't go into a lot of these, but social distance and contested space. We know that there are places that draw a lot of tourists. For example, the example of Lumbini in Nepal, which is the second major point down. The majority of the population in Lumbini are Muslims. And Nepal does not have a large Muslim population, but its Muslim population is located primarily in that area. And so the hosts are Muslims, but the site is Buddhist. This is the birthplace of Buddha. And so millions of Buddhists and Hindus and others come every year to this particular location. And the Muslims are very good hosts. They understand that this is the heritage of other people, other religions. And also they understand that they need to, have good hospitality, provide good hospitality to have satisfied visitors. And so they create this environment of welcoming, etc. So even though they're the current inhabitants of that area, 90% of all of their tourists are Buddhist and Hindu pilgrims. And so the social distance means how close are they socially and culturally together. And there's been some research on this particular Lumbini that shows the cultural distance and social distance between the visited and the visitors. And these are very interesting implications that could be done in any number of religious destinations. Simultaneity of use in sacred space. We talked about this a minute ago. You've got your religious adherents who visit a place for authentic spiritual experiences, but then they're also visited by non-religious tourists who may just be there to get the selfie to post on Facebook, for example, or Instagram. And so how do we disentangle this, or do we need to? Or do pilgrims just need to realize that other tourists need to use it as well? And so the day of old-fashioned pilgrimage is over. You know, who knows? So these are really important management questions that can spark, you know, a lot of conflict between one end of the spectrum and the other end of the spectrum in regards to visitors and their motivations. Denominational differences. We talked about this in terms of souvenirs, but also in terms of destinations and attractions. Even within the Holy Land, in Israel and Palestine, you have different Christian groups will visit different attractions in different towns. You know, there's different locations for the garden tomb, the tomb of Jesus Christ. And so the different religious groups feel, you know, location A is authentic. No, it's location B. And so even within religions, there's conflict related to places and spaces. So I just a couple of pictures regarding this, and I'm almost out of time. But this is the area of Lumbini. Again, it is the birthplace of Buddha, very, very sacred for Buddhists and Hindus, but the majority of the population are Muslims who are the caretakers of these particular sites. And this raises a lot of questions related to social distance and cultural similarities, and acceptance and hospitality and all kinds of questions. But this is the temple that was built over the birthplace of Buddha. You can see they're building a new shrine there at the time I took this picture. And again, all of the workers are probably Muslim local people building a Buddhist shrine. So you have this kind of unique social distance perspective. But even this particular place is also commercialized. And most of these sellers are Muslims selling Buddhist souvenirs. So it's fairly interesting. And then this kind of relates to the conflict between the religious visitors versus the non-religious visitors. And the fact that, unfortunately, the non-religious visitors have to be reminded how to behave. Are these imposing? Does this sort of ruin the experience for worshipers? Or do regular tourists see the worshipers as part of the tourist attraction itself? In many cases, such as this, in what is called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is a whole different chapter of conflict. You have Orthodox, I believe these are Russian Orthodox, most of them, worshiping. Is this part of the attraction for non-religious tourists? Just to touch on another area of interest of mine, which is cross-border management of resources. From a heritage perspective, we know that traditional heritage does not respect political boundaries. Very often architectural styles, buildings, cultures, languages, religions, all of these heritage elements cross borders, because borders are a man-made phenomenon that often divides cultural heritages. So borders traditionally have been barriers to interaction and resource management. There's a lot of cross-border or international trails that cross from one country to another, and a lot of transfrontier cultural areas. And we're not going to go into this a lot, but just again, to draw the parallels between religious heritage and heritage in general. You'll know, obviously, UNESCO has a lot of religious sites on its list, and some of these are in more than one country. And so, and you've got the Jordan River baptismal site, which I'll show you in a minute. It's a very, very important religious destination. I'm just going to go through these pictures quite quickly. This is some of the Romanesque churches in Andorra. And so this is an area of Spain, Andorra, and France that have a very similar cultural asset base that's part of the Unesco. So this is the Jordan River, and I'm standing on the Israeli side, and of course on the other side is Jordan. And you have tourists coming to both sides, but of course you can't cross here. But you have tourists in Jordan visiting that side of the river, and tourists in Israel visiting this side of the river. And then you can see the yellow bubbles that actually marks the borderline. And so the Jordan River is very small at this location. It's very narrow. And so, but it's also a very, very highly guarded military area. And so, in fact, tourism to this particular location only opened up about 15 years ago because of the very sensitive nature of this border. But this is viewed as the probable location of the baptism of Jesus by historians and archaeologists. So you have tourists facing each other in two different countries, but they can't cross. And a lot of religious tourists will come to this site and get baptized themselves, rebaptized in the Jordan River. It's a very common exercise with Christian groups to do this. But again, this is one of the very most special places in the Holy Land. Also related to all of these things we talked about, commercialization, new trends and patterns, there's been very, very little research about guiding religious tourists and pilgrims. If you look at the tourism literature, we all know, all of us that are familiar, we all know that there's a whole lot of research on guiding. You know, the guide as interpreter, the guide as political propagandizer, etc. There's a lot of research on guides and the role of guides in tourism. What there's not a lot of research is guiding religious tourists or pilgrim groups, because this requires special training. This requires special knowledge that just guiding general tourism groups doesn't require. For example, they have to know, if you're a guide, if you're a Muslim guide or a Hindu guide, you have to know the scriptures very, very well. You have to know the stories and the places and the people associated with these stories very well to be able to relate those, for instance. We know, I've talked to a lot of guides that have guided religious groups for many years, and they have some incredible stories to tell. And anybody that wants to do research should start going interviewing guides about their experiences with religious groups, because they have some really special and unique experiences that they wouldn't have if they were just guiding generic tourism groups. But again, these differences between different denominations manifests here too. So if I'm a tour guide in Israel and Palestine, and I'm guiding a Catholic group, I have to behave a certain way. I have to tell certain stories. If I'm guiding an Orthodox group, I have to behave differently and tell different stories a different way, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a really unique perspective on this. And so some guides, for example, in the Holy Land will specialize only in certain groups. So some guides specialize in Latter-day Saints, some guides specialize in Baptists, some guides specialize in Methodists. And so it's quite a specialist career, actually. Here's a group of Christians being guided in Israel. And the guide plays a very important role in the spiritual experiences of the tourists. And guides for a group of Buddhists at Lumbini. They've come up from India, actually. So just in conclusion, the last topic, and I know we're pretty much out of time, so I'm just going to go through is this. There's a lot of different newer manifestations of pilgrimage and religious tourism, things such as, we have to understand that there's a difference between spirituality and religiosity. And not everyone who's spiritual is religious, and not everyone who's religious is spiritual. So there's this division. There's also this, I'll skip New Ageism, but there's also spiritual pilgrimages and non-religious pilgrimages. And there's nationalism, for example. A lot of people who visit national shrines or things like that will often describe it as a spiritual or moving experience, but it's not necessarily a religion-based experience. There's fan pilgrimage. People go to visit the graves of Elvis Presley, or as Martin was talking about, Anzac, that sort of thing. And so you have, these are pilgrimages, but they're not necessarily religious pilgrimages in the traditional sense. I'm going to skip this example because we really don't have time. But if you look, this is the house and grave of Elvis Presley, which is a huge pilgrimage destination. Has nothing to do with religion, but people are fans. They love Elvis, so they go to worship him or to revere him at this particular site. This is the grave of John F. Kennedy, for example, the same sort of thing. And you have personal sites. People will often travel to their personal heritage sites to be close, to feel the spirit or to have some sort of experience. So, second to last slide. What are the unique management challenges? Well, Dan Olson has done a lot on this. Dan, I think he's still on managing religious sites, because it does take a special set of skills and a special set of knowledge to manage religious sites over non-religious heritage sites. So meeting the needs of worshipers and other tourists simultaneously. You have to be able to balance spiritual and secular. Sensitive interpretation at dark sites. By the way, many religious sites and attractions are very dark. They have a very dark history. And so being able to have sensitive interpretation at contested and dark sites. Also, many religions want to share their faith, and so they have to do this while considering the needs of tourists. Helping to create meaningful experiences for religious visitors and other tourists, both. Funding is an important question. Do they just get funding from the religious organization, or should they charge a fee for visitors? This is very controversial. Marketing. Like I said, the destination wants to market. It wants to increase numbers, whether that's religious tourists or non-religious tourists. They want to increase money in visitors. And then how do we lessen the physical impacts of pilgrimage when we know that they leave the same sorts of impacts that other forms of tourism do as well? And then religious organizations versus community economic development officials, which I mentioned before. So to conclude, religious tourism has long been a problem child with regard to social, ecological, and economic sustainability because it resembles mass tourism, even though religious organizations don't want to admit it. So religious organizations still don't want to admit to being part of tourism, even though they are, and they would not want to recognize their mass pilgrimages as a form of mass tourism, even though it is. Religious tourism is a form of heritage tourism from the perspective of the places visited, the experiences sought, the activities undertaken, and the impacts that occur. So I think, honestly, when I talked about food as a major, really hardcore laboratory for heritage, I believe religion and religious tourism is also a very, very good laboratory for heritage, because it demonstrates every element of heritage. There are many new trends in the industry and in academic work that have been long traditions, but we now need to think more inclusively about religious heritage and tourism. We need to think beyond the way we have traditionally thought about pilgrimage versus tourism, because there is no pilgrimage and tourism. It's all tourism. It's just a matter of understanding different perspectives on it. So I think I will leave it there. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Professor. It was really great presentation, which provided us with deeper insights, not only for cultural tourism, but also religious tourism. Please let me ask our participants whether they have any question or contribution.
Okay.
Firstly, I would like to inform you about the one request from our participant. Zafer Öter. Nice presentation there, Professor. Can we access this presentation after the Congress, he asked.
Yeah, I can send it to you, Kadir.
Okay. Then another question I would like to direct you, which was asked for the presentation as well, from Serkan Yiğit. First of all, thank you for your wonderful presentation. In recent years, archaeological studies show that, for example, Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, etc., the beginning of civilization started in Mesopotamia region. So his question for you, can you evaluate the potential of Turkey or Mesopotamia in terms of heritage tourism for future?
Yes, I think the Mesopotamia region and Turkey, Anatolia, the whole region is obviously blessed with great resources, great asset, fabulous history and heritage. There's a lot of potential. And I think obviously the main challenge now is security. And I've been working with, I was helping a colleague in Iraq, for example, looking at many of the ancient biblical and historical sites in Iraq. And Iraq has so much potential for tourism, heritage and religious heritage tourism in particular. But of course, the security situation prevents that. Obviously, I think that the whole area, Turkey, is a very famous heritage tourism destination. And I think the whole region, the number one appeal of the region is heritage and religious heritage in particular. Other people say, well, it's beaches. Yeah, there's some nice beaches and things like that, but really, and some nice nature, but I think it's the heritage that's the most important. So in answer to your question, yes, I think the whole region has a lot of potential for heritage. And I hope personally in the near future, the politics will slow down, will become manageable in such a way that these countries that are suffering, that have a lot of potential, could in fact become better visited by the global community, because yeah, there's a whole lot of potential.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any other question for Mr. Professor in terms of the presentation, or maybe contribution can be as well?
Let's see, there's one here from Zafer. How do you think active participation of worshipers to the same events? Yeah, this is a good question, and it's one of the management problems that's been faced for many years at all pilgrimage destinations, how to manage the worshiper experience while you're also managing the other, the non-worshiper experience. And because you have this, what we call this simultaneity of spaces, and the idea that, leisure tourists combined with religious tourists together in the same space can create a lot of conflict. And I think it's going to require an understanding on the pilgrim's perspective, where they need to be more patient with the tourists, but also the tourists need to be better educated to understand that their behavior affects the worshipper's experience as well. And so I think it's not just one side or the other. Both sides need to work together to create a better environment and better atmosphere, for sure. And that could have to do, there's a lot of work now on responsible tourists and creating educated tourists, and maybe the instructor, the guide, needs to explain to them before they arrive at a sacred site, say, look, you have to behave this way. And so I think it takes information and knowledge sharing. So it's a delicate balance. But sometimes the worshipers get too frustrated and too angry. And so it's both sides have to really realize that there's a whole wide range of users for each particular sacred place.
Any other question? There's not any more.
Okay. Well, you know what? I really have enjoyed being here with everybody today. It was nice to see you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Professor. It was really great honor for us to have you as keynote speaker. And thank you very much for your kind contribution and a great presentation as well. And we wish to host you in Turkey in someday.
Oh, I hope so.
Maybe
You know, I was invited to go to Qatar in January to give a keynote, and also in February to Thailand. And my university has rejected my travel application, what do you call it, your permission to go, because it said, because it's non-essential travel. And so even though it's next year, January and February, my university said, no, you can't go because it's non-essential now because of the pandemic. And so I hope I can come to Turkey again. I haven't been to Turkey for about 5 years, so it's time to come back.
Okay, that's great. We look forward to hosting you in Turkey.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to see you all.
Our session has already ended with a great presentation, which was made by Professor Dylan Timothy. And thank you very much also to our participants for their kind contribution. Thank you very much. Good evening. And good afternoon for you, I think, Mr. Professor, in United States.
Actually, it's early morning. Early morning.
Morning. So. Okay. Good morning.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
See you, Dylan. Thank you.
See you, Martin. Bye, guys.